Case 1. Deborah Meyer. Deborah Meyer was 36 years old, and the people who knew her kept reaching for the same words. Kind, selfless, strong. She was an award-winning nurse, a nurse manager, the person families trusted on the worst day of their lives, the steady voice in a bright hospital hallway. At home in Jeffersonville, Indiana, she was a mother to 3 small children, all of them under the age of 5. Her life was measured in the ordinary, sacred things: a shift finished, a child lifted onto a hip, a quiet drive home. On February 14, 2025, Valentine's Day, that life ended inside the home she had built. The evening had been staged as a celebration. Her husband, Taylor Meyer, had planned something elaborate, a Paris-themed dinner, right down to the Eiffel Towers their small children had drawn, a dress he'd bought her, a meal from a steakhouse. It was the kind of grand gesture that photographs well. But underneath it sat something else. For a month, he had fixated on a single photograph of Deborah beside a coworker, and the suspicion had hardened into something possessive. When Deborah's reaction to the evening didn't match what he felt he was owed, the gesture curdled into rage. She left the house for about 20 minutes. When she came back, he demanded to see her phone. She refused. And in the confrontation that followed, Taylor Meyer attacked and killed his wife while their 3 children slept in the same home. According to the account he later gave investigators, Deborah pleaded with him as it happened. "What are you going to do? Kill me?" she asked. "You're going to hurt me and leave our kids with no parents?" What he did next is the reason this case stays with people. He didn't run. He didn't call for help. He picked up Deborah's phone, took a photograph of her body, and sent it to the man he suspected, captioning it with 2 words: "Your fault." He got that man on the phone and blamed him for tearing his family apart. And he messaged others in Deborah's life to tell them, plainly, what he had done. In a matter of minutes, Taylor Meyer authored the case against himself and sent it out under his wife's name. It was one of those messages that saved no one but revealed everything. A man who received the photo drove to the house and met the officers, already knocking at a silent door. They forced their way in. Taylor Meyer met them aggressively, and it took several officers to bring him into custody. The 3 children were unharmed. Deborah was already gone. There was never any real mystery about who was responsible. He had confessed it himself, in writing, to the people who loved her. On January 29, 2026, after a 6-day trial, a Clark County jury found Taylor Meyer guilty of murder. At sentencing, his own attorney argued he shouldn't serve prison time at all, that he already understood his mistake. Judge Nicholas Carafa rejected that outright and handed down the maximum: 65 years. He told Meyer he saw regret but no remorse, and that the damage done that night would keep surfacing for years. Deborah's best friend stood in that courtroom and counted slowly to 40, so the man responsible would have to sit and feel the weight of each one. Here's our observation, and it's an observation, not a legal finding. The danger in this story didn't announce itself as violence. It announced itself as a grand romantic gesture that came with a bill attached. Affection that demands gratitude, that keeps score, that turns to anger the moment it isn't repaid the right way, that isn't love, and it isn't generosity. It's control looking for a reason. And the second signal sat right beside the first: a partner who believes he's entitled to search your phone, whose jealousy has become surveillance. Those aren't 2 separate red flags. They're the same one, wearing 2 outfits. Possessiveness and devotion can look alike from the outside. The difference is that devotion gives and possession keeps a ledger. Deborah Meyer spent her life being the calm in other people's emergencies. She deserved to be safe in her own home on a night that was supposed to be about love. She was a mother, a nurse, a friend whose absence is still felt by everyone who knew her. Her name was Deborah Meyer, and she is remembered. Case 2. Kimberley Herbert. Kimberley Herbert was 48 years old. She was a mother and a grandmother, the kind of connection that doesn't make headlines while a person is alive, but leaves a room full of people who will stand up for her when she's gone. In Muncie, Indiana, in June of 2016, that is exactly what was taken from her family. Not a stranger's tragedy, but a mother, a grandmother, a woman whose daughter and granddaughter would one day have to speak for her because she no longer could. Kimberley died from her injuries after a violent assault inside her own home. And one of the hardest facts in this case is what did not happen next. When she was gravely hurt, she was not rushed for help. She was left, unattended, at home for an extended period before her husband, Kenneth Herbert, finally arranged for a friend to help take her to the hospital. By the time she reached IU Healthball Memorial, it was too late. She was pronounced dead soon after she arrived. There was a chilling tale in those hours. A friend who came to the house that night would later tell police that Herbert, looking at what he'd done, said the words, "The bee got what she deserved." He did not attend Kimberley's funeral. At first, the case did not move. Years passed. It wasn't until 2021, when a Delaware County Sheriff's detective named John Branson reopened the file, that Kenneth Herbert was finally charged with her murder, nearly 5 years after Kimberley died. And when the case reached a courtroom, the picture that emerged was not of a single terrible night. It was of a pattern. Prosecutors presented testimony that Herbert had admitted to killing his wife and that he had spoken about abusing her without shame. At sentencing, 2 of his own former wives took the stand. 2 women from 2 earlier chapters of his life, describing the same thing the evidence had already shown. Kimberley's daughter and granddaughter stood before the court and asked the judge for the maximum. On August 4, 2023, a Delaware County jury found Kenneth Herbert guilty of murder. Weeks later, at sentencing, the judge agreed the case demanded the maximum and handed down 65 years. Herbert appealed, arguing the evidence wasn't enough to convict him. In 2024, the Court of Appeals rejected that argument and upheld the conviction. The prosecutor put it simply: although justice was delayed in this case, it certainly wasn't denied. Here's our observation, and it's an observation, not a legal finding. The most reliable warning in cases like this often isn't in the relationship you're looking at. It's in the ones that came before it. A person's history with earlier partners is not old news, and it is not just their past. When 2 former partners can describe the same harm, that is not coincidence. That is a pattern speaking. And patterns tend to keep their promises. The women who came forward here could not save Kimberley, but their willingness to say, on the record, what they had lived through is part of what finally held someone accountable. Silence protects the person causing harm. Testimony, even years later, can be the case. Kimberley Herbert was 48 years old, a mother and a grandmother, and the people who loved her never stopped fighting for her. Through the years, the case sat quiet, through the trial, through the appeal. They spoke because she couldn't. Her name was Kimberley Herbert, and she is remembered. Case 3. Michela Hinson. Michela Hinson was 47 years old, and her days began early, before the streetlights gave way to morning, behind the wheel of a school bus for the city of Anderson, Indiana. It's a job that runs on trust. Parents hand over the most precious thing they have and count on the person at the front of the bus to bring them home safe. Michela was that person. A mother herself, she carried other people's children through Anderson's streets and back again, one careful stop at a time. The people who knew her remember someone devoted to her family, to the small daily route of a life built around showing up for others. On June 26, 2024, that life ended in a place no one goes looking for trouble. It wasn't even close to home. Her husband, Jeremy Hinson, drove her north, out of Anderson, out to Elwood, to a quiet cemetery on the rural edge of the county, the kind of place you only end up if someone takes you there. It was mid-afternoon when a passing caller noticed something wrong. A dark SUV parked near the back of Forestville Cemetery, 2 people inside, neither one moving. They knocked on the glass. No response. When Madison County deputies arrived, they found Michela Hinson dead in the driver's seat. She had been shot multiple times at close range. Beside her, in the passenger seat, was Jeremy, alive and appearing to have overdosed, as if the scene were meant to be read as one shared tragedy, two people gone together. But the scene did not read that way, because scenes like this rarely do. The physical evidence told its own story, and it did not match a mutual end. The handgun was holstered on Jeremy's own waistband. Spent shell casings lay on the driver's side floor. And the blood, it was on him, from his forehead to his ankles, the pattern of a man who had been right there for the gunfire, not merely beside a loss. When investigators pieced the afternoon together, what they found was not a pact. It was a killing, arranged to look like something else. Then came his own words. The day after Michela died, while he was being held, Jeremy Hinson sat for a recorded visit with his sister. And on that video, he did not describe an accident. He did not describe a stranger. He said, "Obviously, I wasn't thinking right. I don't know what happened to make me do that." Not what happened to them. What happened to make him do that? On August 21st, 2025, a Madison County jury found Jeremy Hinson guilty of murder and guilty of a firearm enhancement for using a gun to do it. Weeks later, the court sentenced him to 75 years, 55 for taking Michela's life, and 20 more for the weapon he used. A bus driver who spent her mornings getting other people's children safely to where they needed to be would not be coming home from that cemetery. But the people who investigated her death made sure the truth did. Here's our observation, and it's an observation, not a legal finding. Two things in this case are worth carrying out of it. The first is where it happened. Michela was found far from home, in an isolated place, away from anyone who might have seen or helped. And isolation, in the wrong hands, is not romance and it is not chance. It's exposure. If a relationship is under strain and a partner steers you somewhere remote and alone, that instinct in your chest is worth honoring. Tell someone where you're going and who you're with. Keep a thread back to the people who love you. The second is harder, and it matters. What happened in that cemetery was not a man losing control. A scene can be arranged, and a story can be told. I don't know what came over me, but the evidence showed deliberation, not a fog. Violence like this is a choice, not an accident of temper. Naming it that way is not cruelty, it's clarity. Genuine grief and genuine guilt are not the same thing, and physical evidence does not lie for anyone. Michela Hinson spent her working life as the safe pair of hands at the front of the bus, the steady presence between other families in harm. She deserved that same safety, and she was denied it by the one person who should have protected it. She was a mother, a driver, a woman trusted by her whole community. Her name was Michela Hinson, and she is remembered. Case 4. Hope Parks. Hope Parks lived in Crawfordsville, a small county seat town in west-central Indiana where the roads run out past the edge of the streetlights and cross quiet water. She was a wife. She was, by the plain arithmetic of a case like this, a woman who had already survived more than she should have had to, because nearly 20 years before the summer of 2020, in Illinois, the man she married had been convicted of a domestic battery against her. He had already shown Hope, in a court of law, who he was. And still she stayed in his orbit. That, too, is part of who Hope was. A person who kept hoping, in a situation that never earned it. In August of 2020, that hope ran out. On August 20th, Michael Parks walked into the Crawfordsville police station to report his wife missing. He had a story ready. He told officers he hadn't seen Hope in 2 days, that after an argument she'd thrown her wedding rings and keys at him, climbed into a car driven by someone he didn't recognize, and driven off, and that he'd repeatedly tried to reach her and gotten nothing. He played the part. The worried husband, coming forward, doing the right thing, even offering to let police search the home, the picture of a man with nothing to hide. It was a tidy account, the kind meant to close a door rather than open a search. But even as he sat there, saying those words, that story was already coming apart a few miles away. Because Hope had been found, just over 3 miles from their home, on a bridge over Sugar Creek, investigators were at that very moment working the scene where Hope's body had been discovered. He was reporting her missing to officers at the front desk, while across town, other officers were already standing over the answer. What followed was the slow, methodical unraveling of a lie. They searched the couple's property, and piece by piece it gave him up. Dried blood in the driveway and the garage, a bloody footprint, a spent rifle cartridge lying in the yard, Hope's phone locked away in a safe inside the house. Every detail a missing person's story can't explain. And then, with a warrant, they found what Michael Parks had gone to grotesque lengths to hide on the property itself. We won't describe what he did to conceal her. It's enough to say the evidence made the truth undeniable, and that he had planned this before he ever picked up the phone to call it in. Court testimony affirmed the killing was premeditated, researched in advance. Hope had not walked out after an argument. She had never left at all. A neighbor would later say his wife had heard someone screaming that day, a voice crying, "Get off of me, please let me go." Those may have been the last words anyone outside that house ever heard from Hope Parks. Faced with the weight of the evidence, Michael Parks abandoned the story. Days before a jury trial was set to begin in 2022, he withdrew his not guilty plea and admitted, under oath, that he had murdered his wife. A Montgomery County judge sentenced him to 50 years with no parole, a term that will keep him in prison into his 90s. There would be no trial, and by the terms of his plea, no appeal. Just the fact of it entered into the record in his own voice. Here's our observation, and it's an observation, not a legal finding. When someone we love is suddenly missing, the person reporting it is almost never the suspect in our minds. And that instinct is exactly what a staged report is built to exploit. The details that are supposed to reassure us are worth a second look. An account that's a little too complete, a partner who can explain everything except where she actually is, a story that discourages a real search rather than demanding one. If the last person with a missing woman becomes the narrator of her disappearance, that narration deserves scrutiny, not deference. Push for the search. Ask the hard questions early. The hours lost to a believable story are the same hours that protect the person telling it. And there is a harder truth underneath this one. A documented history of harming a partner is not a closed chapter. It is the clearest forecast we have of what may come next. Hope Parks deserved to be searched for by someone who actually wanted her found. She deserved a husband who protected her instead of one she had to survive. In the end, it was investigators, not the man who called her in as missing, who refused to accept the easy story and brought her home to the people who loved her. Her name was Hope Parks, and she is remembered. Case 5. Teresa French. Teresa French was 29 years old, and the people who loved her describe a woman who was easy to love back. She had, they said, an innocence about her, a warmth that reached everybody. A neighbor on Cromer Street in Muncie remembered her as the kind woman who used to look after his son. She was the kind of person who gathered up stray animals in the neighborhood and brought them home. She once bottle-fed an orphaned raccoon, getting up every 2 hours through the night to feed it. She was a young mother of 3, and by every account, her children were the center of her world. She loved them, her sister said, more than life itself. And in the spring of 1993, Teresa was doing one of the bravest and most ordinary things a person can do. She was leaving a marriage that had turned dangerous and trying to build a life on the other side of it. She had every reason to run. Months before she died, her husband, Tony French, had beaten her badly enough that she needed surgery on her face, and she took refuge in a shelter to get away from him. This was not a private suspicion or a rumor. He was, at the time of her death, on probation for battering her. And in the weeks that followed that assault, a close friend of Teresa's would later testify that Tony had said the quiet part out loud. He stopped her in a parking lot, asked where Teresa was, and when she wouldn't tell him, he slammed his fist down and said it plainly. "I'm going to kill her." She never got to reach that other side. On the morning of May 13th, 1993, Teresa was on the phone with her friend Ginger when someone came to the door. "An inspector," Teresa told her. "I'll call you back." She hung up. She never called back. Teresa French was found shot to death in her own Muncie home. There was no robbery, no stranger's motive, no random violence, just a young mother gone in the middle of a divorce, and a community left to ask who could have done this and why. Suspicion turned quickly to her estranged husband, but Tony had an answer for that. He'd been at work. His alibi held, there was no physical evidence tying his hands to the crime, and so, with a wall of doubt between the police and the truth, he walked. The case went cold. Not for weeks. Not for months. For 15 years. For 15 years, Teresa's family lived with a grief that had no period at the end of the sentence. Her sister would later say she had suspected the truth the entire time. But suspicion is not a case. What finally cracked it open, a decade and a half later, was a person, a break in the investigation, someone who could finally speak to what had really happened. And what that break revealed was that Teresa's death had not been the work of a stranger at all. It had been arranged. Tony French had not fired the shot himself. He had paid a man named Jess Woods $5,000 to talk his way to Teresa's door and kill her, choosing to have his estranged wife murdered rather than let her leave, and rather than lose the home he intended to move back into once she was gone. That distinction, that he never pulled the trigger, did not save him, and it should not. In 2008, more than 15 years after Teresa died, a Delaware County jury found Anthony French guilty of murder and of conspiracy to commit murder. The judge sentenced him to 80 years, and he did not mince his words about what had driven it. The case, he said, was solely motivated by greed and control. The man Tony hired, Jess Woods, was convicted the following year and sentenced to 100 years. In the time since, French has challenged his conviction and lost. The courts have left it standing. Here's our observation, and it's an observation, not a legal finding. Two things in this case are worth carrying with you. The first is about the most dangerous season in a controlling relationship: the leaving. Teresa was killed not because she stayed, but because she chose to go. And for a certain kind of person, a partner's independence isn't heartbreak, it's a loss of ownership. When control can no longer hold someone, it sometimes reaches for something final. There was a warning here, spoken in plain words: "I'm going to kill her," standing on top of a documented history of violence and a probation record to match. When someone has already harmed a partner and then says aloud what they intend, that is not venting. That is a forecast, and it deserves to be treated like one. The second thing may be the most useful in this entire case. A murder for hire is not one villain acting alone. It is a plan that has to be spoken to someone before it can happen. Somewhere, before Teresa died, this was proposed, offered, discussed, arranged. If a person ever tells you they want their husband or wife dead, or asks you to help make it happen, that is not dark humor, and it is not blowing off steam. It is the first draft of a homicide. The witness who finally came forward here carried that knowledge for 15 years. Coming forward the first time can stop it before it starts. Teresa French was 29, a mother of 3 who was brave enough to choose a better life and was never allowed to live it. It took 15 years, a family that never let go, and one person willing to finally tell the truth. But the silence around her death was broken, and the men responsible were named in its place. Her name was Teresa French, and she is remembered. Case 6. Sharon Fox. Sharon Fox was 66 years old, and she was careful. In her home outside Petersburg, Indiana, she moved through her days with the quiet caution of someone who knew her own limits. She was afraid of falling, and so she never went from room to room without her glasses and her phone. Those two small things went everywhere she did. It's a detail that seems minor until you understand what it later proved. By the summer of 2020, Sharon was doing something that took real courage. She was ending her marriage to Edward Fox. It had already turned physical once. He had shoved her, and he had moved out, into a camper in a nearby town. Sharon didn't just hope the distance would hold. She took the formal steps so many people are told to take. Weeks before she died, she went to the court and filed a protective order against him. She did everything she was supposed to do. She named the danger. She put it on the record. She asked the system to stand between them. On or about July 17th, that piece of paper met the limits of what paper can do. Investigators believe that on that day, Edward Fox forced his way into Sharon's home, the home a protective order said he was to stay away from, and forced her down the flight of stairs into her basement. She died there, at the bottom of the steps, from a fracture to her spine. And then he left her there. For 2 days, Sharon lay at the bottom of those stairs while the man responsible said nothing and did nothing. It was not until the evening of July 19th that Edward Fox picked up the phone, not to confess, but to ask sheriff's deputies to go check on his estranged wife, as though he were a worried husband and not the reason she needed checking on. When a deputy arrived, he found Sharon exactly where she had been left. The story was meant to read as a terrible accident, an older woman, alone, a fall down the stairs. But Sharon's own careful habits refused to cooperate with that lie. The woman who never walked her house without her glasses and her phone because she was afraid of falling was found without either one. The aids she relied on to keep her safe were nowhere near her. And the lie had another problem. Edward Fox's own phone gave him away. An analysis of his cell data placed him at Sharon's home late on July 16th, into the early hours of July 17th, and back again late on the 17th, there, and there again, at exactly the window investigators believed she was killed. It was not the map of a man who had stayed away. Investigators didn't believe she had simply fallen, and neither, in the end, did a jury. And when police searched deeper, they found the reason a fall down the stairs mattered so much to him. Edward Fox stood to collect on Sharon's death, the beneficiary of more than $300,000 in life insurance. One of those policies paid $200,000, but only for an accidental death. A fall down the stairs wasn't just a story to avoid suspicion. It was, quite literally, the version of Sharon's death that paid. And the clearest proof of what drove him came later. Even after his arrest, even from behind bars, Edward Fox tried to collect that accidental death money, signing over power of attorney to his brother to chase the payout while he sat in a cell for causing the very death he was trying to cash in on. In August of 2021, a Pike County jury found Edward Fox guilty, not only of murder but of burglary, for breaking into the home he had been ordered to stay out of. He was sentenced to 55 years. He appealed, and in 2022, the Court of Appeals reviewed the evidence and affirmed his convictions. They stand today. Here's our observation, and it's an observation, not a legal finding. Sharon Fox did everything right. That is the hardest and most important truth in her case. She recognized the danger, she left, and she got a protective order. And we say this plainly, because no one should ever hear this story and conclude she failed to protect herself. She didn't. What her case shows is something the system doesn't always say out loud. A protective order is a legal tool, not a physical barrier. It records the danger. It does not, by itself, stop a person willing to ignore it. And the period right after someone files one can be the most volatile of all. So if you or someone you love is at this exact point, leaving, with an order in place, the order is the beginning of a safety plan, not the whole of it. Change the locks. Tell the neighbors and the employer what's happening and what the person looks like. Vary your routine. And most of all, build a circle of people who check on you on a schedule, because Sharon lay alone for 2 days, and the only person who called was the one who should never have been near her. The people who love you, checking in like clockwork, are protection that paper can't provide. Sharon Fox was a cautious, careful woman who took every careful, deliberate step to protect herself, and was failed not by her own courage, but by a man who refused to accept the word no. She deserved to grow old in the home she was fighting to keep. She deserved a system and a circle that reached her in time. Her name was Sharon Fox, and she is remembered. Case 7. Robin Baxter. Robin Lynn Baxter was 32 years old, and by every account of the people who knew her, she was the easy kind of person to have in your life. Happy-go-lucky, her friends said. Liked by everyone. A woman with no enemies. She lived in New Albany, Indiana, in a little house on Troy Street, close enough to the Ohio River that you could feel it in the air. She was the sort of friend who stayed in touch, who picked up the phone, who people noticed when she suddenly went quiet. In June of 1990, she went quiet. On the night of June 19th, neighbors heard Robin and her husband, Christopher Baxter, arguing. And at around 10 o'clock that evening, Robin managed to call a friend named Tanita. She was crying. She spoke in a whisper, as though she didn't want to be heard. She told her friend that Christopher had been acting worse than she had ever seen him, and then she said the thing that would haunt everyone who loved her, that he was going to kill her. It was one of the last times anyone who cared about Robin would hear her voice. The next day, when friends came looking for her, Christopher told them Robin was missing. 4 days later, on June 23rd, a body was found floating in the Ohio River, across from a Louisville park. It was Robin. She had died from injuries to her head. Christopher Baxter spoke to the police, and he spoke to the local news, saying he hoped whoever knew what happened would come forward. But when detectives questioned him more closely, his account had a strange shape to it. He said the two of them had argued, an argument that, by trial testimony, had flared over something as small as a spaghetti dinner, that he'd smashed out the glass in the back door, and that he had blacked out, waking in the early morning to find Robin gone. And when a detective asked him directly whether he had killed his wife, he did not say no. He said, "Well, I might have done it, and I might not have. I blacked out." And then he added something that would sit in the file for the next 2 decades. "If I did do it, I want the electric chair." There was something else in that house that friends noticed. Baxter kept a solid aluminum bar propped against the wall near a closet, a weapon he'd given a nickname, calling it the Enforcer, or the Equalizer. A friend who visited the day before Robin vanished saw no damage to the walls. When she came back 2 days later, there was a hole punched in the wall. Christopher said he'd done it, that it was better than hitting his wife, and the bar was no longer in its usual place. Another friend would testify that the hole had already been freshly patched over. At the time, it was just odd. It would take 22 years to understand what it meant. Because it wasn't enough. The evidence was thin and largely circumstantial, and no charge could be built on a maybe. Christopher Baxter walked out of that investigation a free man, and Robin's case went cold. Not for a year, for 22 of them. But here is the thing about what Christopher Baxter knew. He could not seem to keep it inside. Over the years that followed, he talked. He talked to a friend he was driving home one night, drunk, crying, insisting out of nowhere, "You know I'd never hurt you. You know I'd never hurt you on purpose." Even his own half-brother told police, back in 1990, that a man at a bar had been claiming involvement in Robin's death. The words kept leaking out, year after year, into bars and conversations and the ears of people who remembered them. And eventually, one of those people carried what they'd heard to the police. In 2011, the case was reopened. An informant came forward, and with their help, investigators recorded Christopher Baxter admitting to the crime. When detectives went back to that old house on Troy Street, the new tenant told them something remarkable, that while moving in, he'd accidentally broken through a wall and found, hidden inside it, a metal bar, a pair of gloves, and tissue paper. Robin's own mother had given police a photograph years earlier of Christopher with a bar just like it. The thing that had been hidden in the wall of that house had waited 22 years to be found. In February of 2012, Christopher Baxter was arrested. In July, a Floyd County jury found him guilty of murder. He was sentenced to prison, and he has maintained his innocence throughout, telling the court, "I'm innocent." He appealed. The Court of Appeals upheld his murder conviction, though it found the trial court had used a newer sentencing standard instead of the one in effect back in 1990, and sent the sentence back to be brought within the older limit. The conviction stands. After 22 years, Robin Baxter's death was finally answered for. Here's our observation, and it's an observation, not a legal finding. This case turned on a simple, human truth. The people who do these things often cannot carry them alone. The knowledge leaks, in a drunken moment, in a boast, in a late-night confession to someone they think will keep it. For 22 years, the answer to Robin's death was out there, sitting in the memory of ordinary people who had heard something they couldn't forget. And what finally brought it home was not a fingerprint or a machine. It was a person deciding that what they knew was too heavy to keep. So if someone ever tells you they hurt someone, or hints at it, or jokes about a death in a way that doesn't sit right, that is not a confidence to protect. That is information a family has been waiting years to hear. And there is a second truth here, spoken in Robin's own whisper on the phone. When a person tells you they are afraid someone will kill them, believe them. Say it back to someone who can help. Cold cases don't thaw on their own. They thaw because someone finally speaks. The first person to come forward is sometimes the only reason a case is ever closed. Robin Baxter was 32, a warm and well-loved woman who deserved decades more of the friendships she gave so freely. She was failed by a silence that lasted 22 years, and she was finally served by the person and the investigators who refused to let that silence be permanent. Her name was Robin Baxter, and she is remembered. Case 8. Melinda Lindsey. Melinda Lindsey was 23 years old. She was a young wife and a young mother. At the very start of the life most people are only beginning to build at that age, the small house in the country, the early mornings, the ordinary future that stretches out ahead of you when you're 23 and assume you have all the time in the world. Her home sat along a state road in Center Township in rural Porter County, Indiana. It was the kind of quiet place where nothing is supposed to happen. On the morning of January 16, 2015, in the hours before dawn, Melinda was shot and killed as she slept in her own bed. When Porter County officers arrived at the house, they found a scene that seemed, at first, to tell a story of its own. Melinda's husband, Stephen Lindsey, was on his knees, his hands bound behind his back with zip ties. He told police the couple had been the victims of a violent home invasion, that an intruder had overpowered him while he slept, knocked him unconscious, bound him, and left him helpless elsewhere in the house, and that he had come to only at the sound of the gunshot that took his wife's life. In his account, he was a survivor of the same attack that killed Melinda, a man who couldn't save her. But the story, examined closely, did not hold its shape. Consider what this intruder was supposed to have done. He had broken into a home in the middle of the night, subdued and tied up the husband, and then, prosecutors argued, rather than rob the place, rather than harm the man he'd already restrained, he walked past him, shot only Melinda as she lay in bed, and left again, taking nothing. Nothing stolen, nothing that matched the way a real stranger behaves. Just a wife dead in her bed, and a husband on his knees, conveniently bound, conveniently alive. There was also a pattern that came before that night. In the weeks and months prior, Stephen Lindsey had made a series of reports to police, an attempted break-in, thefts, trespassing at the home. His own brother testified he'd been aware of them. To prosecutors, those reports weren't a family under siege from the outside. They were the groundwork for a story, an intruder established on paper, ready to be blamed when the time came. And then there were the zip ties themselves. They were not ordinary hardware store ties. Investigators determined they were a specialty type, the kind sold locally only at electrical supply stores, and the very same kind used by the companies that had employed Stephen Lindsey, who worked as a lineman. The restraints that were supposed to prove he was a victim traced straight back to his own trade. Prosecutors laid out why. They alleged that Stephen Lindsey shot Melinda because he feared she was going to leave him, a controlling husband who would rather end her life than lose control of it, and that money ran underneath it all. The couple was falling behind on their bills, and Melinda had taken out a life insurance policy worth more than $1 million. The intruder, prosecutors argued, had never existed. He had been invented and then bound into place to hide the fact that the danger in that house had been inside it all along. And in the days right after Melinda died, before he had been cleared of anything, evidence at trial showed Stephen moving quickly to have her body cremated. The case was not an easy road to a verdict. Stephen Lindsey took the witness stand and denied it all. Denied the money troubles, denied killing his wife, insisting he and Melinda were both victims. 2 earlier attempts to try him faltered. One ended in a mistrial, and another in a hung jury, where the panel split without agreement. But at his 3rd trial in 2016, after weeks of evidence, a Porter County jury found Stephen Lindsey guilty of murder. He has always maintained his innocence. The judge was not persuaded, telling him plainly that the evidence showed otherwise, and sentenced him to 55 years. Lindsey appealed, and in 2017, the Indiana Court of Appeals upheld his conviction. It stands. Here's our observation. And it's an observation, not a legal finding. There is a particular kind of story that gets told after a domestic killing. The random intruder, the stranger in the night, the violence that supposedly came from outside. And there is a reason investigators learn to look hardest at exactly that story. Because a real stranger breaking into a home behaves like a stranger. He takes things, he flees, he doesn't carefully tie up one person and kill another and leave the rest untouched. When a death is dressed up as a break-in, the tells are often not in what's present, but in what's missing. Nothing stolen, no sign of a real stranger, a survivor whose survival is a little too neat, and sometimes a trail of earlier incidents that quietly built the story in advance. The absence of evidence can be the evidence. So if you ever find yourself on the outside of a story like this, a friend's death, a relative's, explained away as a convenient stranger no one can find, it is not disloyal to notice what doesn't add up. The intruder who leaves everything and takes only one life is worth a second, harder look. Melinda Lindsey was 23, with the whole shape of a life still in front of her, and she deserved to live every year of it. She could not tell investigators what happened in that house, so the evidence spoke for her, and a jury listened. Her name was Melinda Lindsey, and she is remembered. Case 9. Rebecca Hoover. Rebecca Ruth Hoover was 38 years old, a wife and a mother in New Albany, Indiana. She was somebody's daughter, too, and that detail matters in her story, because when the world went quiet around Rebecca, it was her own mother who refused to accept the silence. That is who Rebecca was to the people who loved her. Not a missing persons flyer, but a daughter whose mother would not stop asking where she was. Rebecca was last seen on August 2, 2020. Police would later determine that was the day she died, inside her own home. And this was not a marriage without warning signs. Just 4 months earlier, in April of 2020, Judson Hoover had been arrested and charged with domestic battery and strangulation against Rebecca. When he killed her that August, he was still free, out on pretrial release in that very case. The danger in Rebecca's home was not a secret from the system. It was already on the record. But for weeks after August 2nd, the world was told a different story, or rather, told nothing at all. Rebecca had simply, it seemed, gone. And while her family grew frantic, the person who should have been most frantic of all was calm. Because Rebecca's husband was not searching for her. He was filing paperwork. The day after Rebecca was last seen alive, the day after police believe he killed her, Judson Hoover went to court and filed for divorce. And in that filing, he told the court he did not know where his wife was. It was a masterpiece of cold calculation. On paper, he became a husband abandoned by a wife who had wandered off, rather than the reason she would never come home. He moved quickly to secure what he wanted from her absence, a provisional order granting him their home and custody of the children. He built a legal record around a lie. Weeks later, that divorce case reached its first hearing on August 21st. Rebecca did not attend. Of course she didn't. The court, not yet knowing what had happened, simply noted her absence, a woman who failed to appear for her own divorce. In truth, she had been dead for nearly 3 weeks. But a lie told on paper still has to survive contact with the facts, and this one didn't. Rebecca's mother had reported her missing, and investigators kept pulling threads. They learned Judson Hoover had rented a storage unit. They found he had purchased large containers and had even texted a photo of that purchase to a friend. Surveillance footage placed him at the storage facility, moving something heavy. And then came the piece that broke everything open. The couple's 8-year-old son found the courage to tell a counselor at his school what had happened to his mother. A small boy carried the heaviest truth in this case, and he carried it to a trusted adult, and that adult made sure it reached the people who could act on it. On August 31st, in that Louisville storage unit, they found Rebecca. The story on paper collapsed all at once. Judson Hoover was arrested, and at his very first court appearance, he stopped pretending. He pleaded guilty to murdering his wife. This was not a man wrongly accused. This was a confession. And when the court examined what he had done, it did not hold back. The judge found his conduct particularly egregious. A man who had concealed his wife's body and then stood before a divorce court and lied that he didn't know where she was. It was not the first sign of trouble in that home either. Police had been called there many times, and the court recognized a history of domestic abuse behind the marriage. In November of 2020, Judson Hoover was sentenced to the maximum the law allowed, 65 years. He appealed that sentence, and in 2021, the Court of Appeals upheld every year of it. Here's our observation, and it's an observation, not a legal finding. Grief does not rush to the courthouse. When someone truly vanishes, the people who love them panic. They search. They beg for information. They cannot think about anything else. What they do not do in the first hours is calmly file for divorce, claim the house, and secure custody while insisting they have no idea where their partner has gone. Judson Hoover's paperwork told on him, because a paper trail is far harder to fake than a story. The dates don't move. The filings are stamped. And when the administrative moves come faster than the worry, when someone is positioning for advantage before anyone has even found the person who's missing, that contradiction is worth noticing. There is a harder warning underneath this one too. Rebecca's danger was already documented, including a prior strangulation. And that specific detail carries a weight everyone should know. A partner who has strangled you once is among the clearest signals that violence can escalate to something final. It is not a phase, and it is not to be minimized. It is a reason to get help and get out. No single person in Rebecca's life held the whole truth. Her mother had a piece, a storage facility had a piece, a divorce court had a piece that didn't add up, and a child held the piece that mattered most. It was only when those pieces came together that the lie fell apart. So if something about a person's disappearance doesn't sit right with you, say it. Report the piece you hold. You may be holding the corner that makes the whole picture make sense. Rebecca Hoover was 38 years old, a daughter and a mother who deserved to be looked for by everyone who should have looked for her, and who was failed most by the one person the law expected to protect her. In the end, it was her mother's refusal to be silent, a young boy's courage, and investigators who would not accept a tidy story that brought Rebecca home. Her name was Rebecca Hoover, and she is remembered. Case 10. Kathy Taylor. Kathy Taylor was 23 years old, and by every description of her, she was exactly the kind of young woman the phrase, "her whole life ahead of her," was made for. Happy, vibrant, newly married, standing right at the beginning of everything. She had grown up in Vincennes, Indiana. In October of 1973, after a short courtship, she married a charming, outgoing young man named Earl Taylor, and the two of them settled into a home in a rural estate north of Terre Haute. She was a bride at 21, and by 23, she was gone. On April 2, 1975, Earl Taylor told police he had come home from running errands, called out for his wife, and gotten no answer. He said he found Kathy in the bathtub, an electric clock radio sunk in the water beside her. The finding at the time was as tidy as it was tragic. An accidental electrocution, a young woman lost to a freak household accident. No charges were filed. Kathy Taylor was buried, and the questions about how she really died were buried with her, for 4 decades. But here is what makes Kathy's case so hard to bear. The warning signs had never been hidden. They were there before she ever died. Right up until the wedding, Earl had been seeing another woman. And just 2 weeks after he married Kathy, he told that other woman something chilling, that he had life insurance on his new wife, and that, in his words, people do have accidents. He said they would have nothing to worry about. The woman he said it to was alarmed enough that she sat down and wrote Kathy a letter, warning her. Earl had taken out insurance on Kathy by telling the agent his wife was too sick to come in, and signing her name himself, in his own handwriting. And according to investigators, when Kathy learned that policies had been taken out on her life without her knowledge, she told the insurance representative that she was afraid her husband was going to kill her. Kathy Taylor said it out loud, to someone, before she died. And still, in 1975, her death was called an accident. Her family never believed it. Her sister would later say the family had known the truth for 41 years. And they were not the only ones who should have looked harder. Because the story of Earl Taylor did not end with Kathy. More than a decade later, Earl had a second wife, Mindy. And here the pattern becomes almost unbearable, because someone tried to stop it. According to the Indianapolis Star, when Earl set out to remarry, a representative from the very same insurance company recognized what they were seeing and reached out to his bride-to-be, Mindy, to tell her about Kathy's death and to warn her that she, too, could be in danger. The warning was there. It was delivered. But the machinery that should have made it matter, a real investigation into how Kathy died, had never been set in motion. And in 1987, Mindy Taylor died. Her body was recovered from her car, submerged in a pond. Another wife. Another death by water. Another accident that wasn't. This time, the system did not look away. Earl Taylor was convicted in 1988 of murdering Mindy and sentenced to 60 years. And when investigators examined that case, they found something chillingly familiar. Earl had taken out a life insurance policy on Mindy worth $600,000. He had, it turned out, a pattern and a price list. Earl Taylor served more than 25 years for Mindy's murder. And then, in January of 2014, he was released from prison. He had, in the eyes of the law, paid his debt for one wife. The other was still waiting. That same year, Kathy's cold case was reopened, aided by a cold case team and national attention. And in 2016, 41 years after Kathy died in that bathtub, Earl Taylor finally stood trial for her murder. This time, the accident did not survive the science. An electrical engineering professor took the stand and testified that the radio Earl blamed simply did not carry enough voltage to electrocute anyone, and investigators noted the appliance's cord had even been altered to make it long enough to reach the tub in the first place. A forensic pathologist testified that Kathy had not been electrocuted at all, that she had most likely been drowned, held down in the water in her own home. And a prosecutor summed up the motive in a single cold phrase. Earl Taylor, he said, had 30,000 reasons for Kathy to die, the value of a life insurance policy Earl had tried to take out on the young wife he married in 1973. A jury convicted Earl Taylor of murdering Kathy. On March 23, 2016, a Vigo County judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would challenge the outcome afterward, but the conviction has stood. After 41 years, the freak accident was finally called what it was. And then Kathy's sister said the thing that this entire case, and maybe this entire episode, comes down to. In her statement to the court, she said that if the justice system had not failed Kathy in 1975, if someone had looked harder at that first accident, then Mindy would still be alive. One unexamined death had cost a second woman her life. Here's our observation, and it's an observation, not a legal finding. Some patterns can only be seen from a distance, across years, and that is exactly what makes them so dangerous. A single tragic accident invites sympathy, not suspicion. But when the same misfortune visits the same person twice, when a second partner dies the way the first one did, when there is a life insurance policy sitting quietly behind each loss, the coincidence stops being a coincidence. The lesson here is not just for detectives. It is for all of us. When a person's history includes more than one convenient death, more than one accident that happened to pay, that history deserves to be taken seriously the first time a question is raised, not the second, not the 40th year. Because the cost of treating a murder as an accident is not only injustice for the person who died, it is the next person who might still be saved. Kathy's death should have been the warning. Instead, it took Mindy's death to make anyone listen, and Kathy's own to finally be heard. Kathy Taylor was 23 years old, a bright and hopeful young woman who deserved the long life everyone assumed she had ahead of her. For 41 years, she waited for the truth to be spoken out loud, carried all that time by a family that never once believed the lie. And though the justice that reached her came far too late to save the woman who came after her, it came. Her name was Kathy Taylor, and, together with Mindy, she is remembered. 10 women. Say their names with us. Deborah Meyer, Kimberley Herbert, Michela Hinson, Hope Parks, Teresa French, Sharon Fox, Robin Baxter, Melinda Lindsey, Rebecca Hoover, Kathy Taylor, and Mindy, who died because no one looked closely enough the first time. Different towns, different decades, but look at how much they shared. Nearly every one of these women was leaving or simply becoming a person of her own, filing for divorce, asking for space, keeping a phone to herself, building a life her husband could no longer command. And each time, a man decided that if he could not keep her, no one would. Understand that clearly, because it is the truest thing in this episode. This was never about love. Love does not require ownership. What we watched, 10 times over, was possession, and what possession turns into the moment it feels itself slipping. Then came the lie. An accident. An intruder. An overdose. A wife who supposedly just walked away. And here is the single frame that holds all 10 cases together. Carry this one out with you. A lie like this needs 3 things to survive. A story, a silence, and time. A story to explain the death. The silence of everyone who suspected and said nothing. And time enough for both to harden into case closed. Take away any one of the 3, and the truth comes home. Every one of these men foresaw the story holding forever. What none of them foresaw, the unforeseen fate in every one of these files, was the person who refused to keep the silence. Look at who they were. A sister who would not believe an accident for 41 years. A friend who kept a warning letter. A mother who never stopped asking where her daughter was. A child brave enough to tell a trusted adult the truth. Neighbors, co-workers, even an insurance clerk who recognized a pattern. And behind them, the investigators who reopened dead files, the experts who proved the accident impossible, the reporters who kept asking, the juries who listened, and the judges who refused to look away. The lie is powerful, but it has never once survived a single person who decided not to carry it. So if this episode leaves you with anything, let it be this. You may never be a detective, but you might be exactly the silence a lie is counting on. A story too smooth. A bruise explained a little too often. A friend who says, quietly, that she's afraid. In those moments, you are not powerless. You are the one thing the lie cannot survive. And if the person in danger tonight is you, hear this plainly. Leaving is the most dangerous moment, and you were never meant to do it alone. In the United States, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is there any hour of the day. Call 1-800-799-7233 or text START to 88788. Tell one person. Make one plan. Reach for help before you need it, not after. 10 women trusted the men who promised to love them. We cannot give them back their years, but we can refuse the silence that was used against them, and we can make sure their names outlast the men who took them. That is the whole reason this channel exists. If it matters to you too, stay with us and share this so one more person learns to read the warning early. Until next time, watch closely, love fiercely, and never look away.